So, in science, true science, in my view, this is all my opinion, there is an ongoing sort of desire, a drive towards approximating the truth as well as we can. And there's coupled with that an openness to any hypothesis, so, assuming it actually makes some sense intuitively and based on the available understanding and evidence that we have. That is to say that, in principle, just about anything could be possible, but you just got to back it up in some way before people will accept it. That's I think, a reasonably scientific point of view. That's really what skepticism is in my mind. Skepticism is not simple doubtfulness of a thing. And that's an oversimplification. It is being doubtful of something when there is no evidence to support it, perhaps. It is, perhaps more broadly, a desire to allow the available evidence and reason to guide one's positions on whatever the topic may be. Why do I bring this up? Well, there is a movement that I've talked about before, and many people who see this may actually consider themselves a part of said movement. But that is, my hair's a mess here. The skeptic movement, the internet skepticism or skeptic movement. These people who consider themselves evidence-based or to be science enthusiasts, or use whatever buzzword or label you like. Some of them are. Many of them, however, just signed up to be a part of a group, right? They want to be a part of some ongoing war, some tribal conflict between people who consider themselves on the side of science and the others, right? The out group. Whether it's people who are members of alt-med or who are anti-this or pro-that, people are going to categorize themselves and their perceived enemies in a variety of ways. I'm not going to waste time listing off a ton of them. And I think there's a problem there, because many people say that, well, science is better than everything else, or science is better than this other approach, and that's true. But the problem is then they follow up by not actually doing science, or not actually being scientific in their own conduct. That's a problem, because it gives ammunition to people who hold stances that might be considered less scientific to say, oh, well, they're just zealots, they're just dogmatic. We can't allow dogmatism to guide us. There's a pendulum that's always swinging back and forth in a variety of fields, right? But just broadly in science, we see that a certain movement will crop up and drive public, certain ideas that are in the public sphere and society in one direction. And then there's a reaction to it that pulls things back in the other direction. And many people who are now part of this sort of internet skeptic movement, many people who actually have no formal background in science and they don't have training in it, or they don't work in that sphere in any meaningful way outside of what they do on social media. Many of these people join a particular group as a reaction, right? They are part of this reactionary movement that's pushing back. And there's nothing wrong with reacting to pseudoscience and trying to educate people, trying to push back against it. But we have to be careful, because it can be very tempting to become dogmatic in our own right, to become very uncompromising, very unyielding. When, again, as I said at the beginning, science is about being open to certain things. Now, you just don't choose to believe a thing unless you've been given some compelling reason to. That's perfectly reasonable. That's great. But when you say, nope, the science is settled on X, whatever the topic may be, you do a disservice in many cases to the discussion that we really should be having. What's an example? I actually commented on a friend's post last night about, a number of quote-unquote fake diseases. And they're the kind of the standard skeptics list, this bullet point list that a lot of people who themselves actually don't work in medicine, there's an irony there, they love to memorize these things and say, these are fake diseases, whether it's chronic Lyme disease or adrenal fatigue or a variety of other things, right? They become these buzzwords that people read off or they rattle off. And I get it, because it's easy to kind of do these cliff notes or take these shortcuts and say, well, under the vast majority of cases, when people bring up these diseases, they're talking about something that's not real or something that's very misunderstood. or some phenomenon that's getting turned into a disease when really it's just some other thing that shouldn't be classified as a disease, whatever. And again, I'm not an expert on medicine. I want to put that out there. But here's my thinking. There are many cases under which, maybe very narrow cases, very specific cases, under which a particular disease or a particular syndrome or set of conditions may actually exist. And when, in your effort to be a skeptic warrior, you decide to push back against the pseudoscientific claims that, oh, all this stuff is disease X, by saying, oh, none of it is, ever, full stop, you're not much better. Because again, you're contributing to this absolutist, dogmatic kind of mindset, this mentality that, you stand on one side of a line or another. This is the science line, or this is the science side, and this is the non-science, the pseudoscience side. That's not how it works. You should be willing to have the conversation and be open to the possibility that, okay, under some conditions, maybe this is a real thing, but maybe just all these other people over here are mischaracterizing it, or they're not using it properly, or something. That, to me, seems like a much more reasonable position. And then you allow the chips to fall where they may once you evaluate that evidence, assuming that you're competent to do so. And if you're not able to, then you find people who can, and you talk to them. But again, I see this pendulum swinging back and forth, and I think that for every one person who's a good skeptic, a true skeptic, in I guess my sense of the word, somebody who tries to be as emotionally detached and doesn't try to take these mental shortcuts and really does want to perform an honest, objective, impartial evaluation of the evidence, you get a dozen or more who just want to memorize a certain set of talking points so they can belong to the right tribe. It's not to say that people who are pro-vaccination generally are on the wrong side of history. I think in many cases, and I'm just using vaccination as an example, many people who are members of these online groups who consider themselves part of this movement per se are generally on the, quote, right side of history. But they themselves are not thinking scientifically about it. It's not, being a scientist or being a science enthusiast should not just be about believing the right stuff. You should arrive at your conclusions for the right reasons. And you should be willing to overturn those positions or modify them, tweak them, make allowances, have exceptions or caveats when there's a compelling reason to do so. That doesn't diminish you. That actually makes you better as a scientist or as a thinker, as a critical thinker, as a skeptic. So if you really want to contribute to the movement, be a reasonable person. Be willing to have that conversation. Be willing to allow that, okay, maybe under 95% of the cases that we tend to see, this claim is a pseudoscientific claim. But then under the other 5%, maybe it's not. That's okay. And in fact, when you talk to people who do research in these fields, you often find, not always, there are exceptions, of course. Part of this is about being, open to exceptions. But generally, it's been my experience, anecdote alert, it's been my experience that people who really are experts on a topic are less dogmatic. Yet the people who are basically glorified lay people, those who know just a little bit about it and they happen to be in one of these skeptic groups, become much more hardline on a lot of subjects. You get the pro-vaccination, pro-GMO people, pro-this, anti-that, whatever, depending on the issue. And again, it becomes this kind of tribal, draw a line in the sand, this is right, this is wrong, binary mentality that has very little place in a scientific discussion. Yes, there are certain things where pretty much, there is one side that's got a mountain of evidence in favor of it versus another side that has little to none. There are cases like that, but you have to be careful, again, about being unyielding, being this dogmatic, absolutist kind of person. We don't need more of those people in science. Just my thoughts. I don't know. So when the pendulum starts swinging, be willing to stop it before it goes all the way to the other extreme. Because very rarely is the truth all the way one extreme. I'm not saying it's smack in the middle, but being willing to accept wherever it should fall makes you a better thinker. Thanks for listening.